China's Loess Plateau is a region that stretches for 640,000 square kilometers across north-central China. Unspoilt valleys in neighboring Sichuan show us how it might once have looked. It's the sort of natural abundance that is necessary to support an emerging civilization. How could a landscape with such potential have been reduced to this? When Chinese scientists and civil engineers began to survey the area, they realized that several thousand years of agricultural exploitation had denuded the hills and valleys of vegetation. The relentless grazing of domestic animals on the slopes meant that there was no chance for young trees and shrubs to grow. The rainfall no longer seeped into the earth, but simply washed down the hillsides, taking the soil with it. Over millennia, this progressively destroyed the region's fertility. These gullies are evidence of the enormous power of runoff during the rainy season. Without vegetation cover on the hillsides, when the rains come, the water doesn't soak into the ground but flows away in a flood. Then it's not available for agriculture during the rest of the year. This leads to drought and, famously for Ethiopia, famine. There is hope that the situation here can be reversed.
Yeah, that root could survive? No.
In just 6 years, Professor Legessa Nagash and local villagers have transformed a severely eroded terrain by planting indigenous trees and plants. Almost miraculously, a clear flowing stream has emerged where once there was a muddy trickle.
So we designed up a system that would harvest every single bit of rainwater that fell on it. On 10 acres, there's 1.5 kilometres of swale water harvesting ditch on contour, and when they're full, 1 million litres of water soak into the landscape, and they'll fill quite a few times over a winter. And then we heavily mulched those swales with organic matter, which was trash from organic fields nearby. And we put that almost 1/2 metre deep. So we saved that and mulched our swales, which are about 2 metres wide and 1/2 metre deep on the trench. Then we put micro irrigation underneath the mulch. And then on the uphill side of the water harvesting trench, we put nitrogen fixing very hardy pioneer desert trees, which help shade and reduce wind evaporation, and also put nitrogen into the soil and structure the soil for us. And then on the lower side of the trench we put fruit trees, majoring in date palms as the long-term overstory in the end. And then we put in figs, pomegranates, guavas, mulberries, now some citrus. Within 4 months we had figs a metre high with figs on, which is impossible. We'd done a course, male and female course, trained up some locals, and we got a translator who's working for the project. He had his degree in agriculture in the Jordan University, and he got onto his mates and said in the agricultural department, well, you said we couldn't grow figs, we got figs growing and we got figs on them. You better come and test the soil, because no matter what you say, we're either growing in salty soil what we shouldn't be growing, or we've desalted the soil, and we'd like to know what we've done. They came in and the salt levels were dropping, so they became interested. The salt levels were dropping around the swales. They said you must have washed it through. See, normally put a huge amount of water on and wash the salt through to the lower levels, which just makes the groundwater more salty. In the end, you'll salt it 20 metres deep if you keep doing that, and then it will take 1,000 years to recover. And we used only 1/5 the amount of water. So the water, they thought we'd washed it all through. No, we'd used 1/5. That really got them when they realised how much water we hadn't used. With the same amount of water normally used on that much area, we could have done 50 acres. Originally, people laughed at us because we didn't put straight lines in. We went on contour with these swales. They thought, why don't you put it straight? You've got a bulldozer, you can flatten the desert, you can straighten it. So we want to go on contour because we've got a longer edge and we harvest the water passively. Then we planted more non-fruiting trees than we did fruit trees, so they laughed at us. This is what we were planting done productive things more than productive things. What's the point, you know? In soil that won't even grow anything, so you know. And then we covered all the inside of the swell with a huge amount of mulch, where they scrape all their organic matter off and burn it, like most traditional agriculture. In the middle of winter, we got a funny email saying, "We've got a problem. We've got mushrooms growing in the swale." Well, they called it fungus, but when we saw a photograph of it, it was mushrooms, because they'd never seen mushrooms, because they'd never had that much humidity in living history in the soil. And when you open up the mulch, there's all these little animals there, you know, there's little insects, and the soil has come alive. And the fungi net that's underneath the mulch is putting off a waxy substance which is repelling the salt away from the area. And the decomposition is locking the salt up. And the salt is not gone, it's become inert and insoluble. So we could regreen the Middle East. We could regreen any desert. And we could desalt it at the same time.
To me, this is very profound for a particular reason. 1804, eastern Kansas near Donovan. This is what he wrote: "The plains of this country are covered with elite green grass, well calculated for the sweetest and most nourishing hay, interspersed with copses of trees, spreading their lofty branches over pools, springs, or brooks of fine water. Groups of shrubs covered with most delicate fruit to be seen in every direction, and nature appears to have exerted herself to beautify the scenery by the variety of flowers, delicately and highly flavored, raised above the grass, which strikes and perfumes the sensations and amuses the mind and throws it into conjecturing the cause of so magnificent a scenery in a country thus situated far removed from the civilized world, to be enjoyed by nothing but the buffalo, elk, deer, and bear in which it abounds, and savage Indians." Now that's what he wrote. Now he couldn't spell worth a hoot, but he was an excellent writer. But look, you know, several things in here to note, folks. Number one, that by 1804, this was such an unusual sight. He wrote about this so profoundly, in such a profound way, that to say that I've never seen this before, my eyes have never laid themselves on a scene like this before. But yet, 200 years earlier, you could have seen that scene in the eastern U.S., in the Atlantic states. But by 1804, the eastern half of the country was so degraded that this was highly unusual for him. Dr. David Montgomery. And so this was one of the charts that he presented looking at global soil degradation. And if you look across North America, where is the highest degree of soil degradation? In our breadbasket, right? In the heart of our so-called Corn Belt. And David Pimental in 1995 said that over the last 40 years, and remember this was 95 that he made this comment, okay? So we're more than 20 years removed from that, but he said over the last 40 years, soil erosion and degradation has caused farmers to abandon about 430 million hectares of arable land, equivalent to about 1/3 of all present cropland. This is also a picture presented by David Montgomery at the Grass-Fed Exchange Conference. This is Palouse, Washington in 1970. How many have been there? How many from there? Okay? You know, if you've been there, you know that this is wheat country, right? Lots and lots of wheat grown in this area. But you see the tremendous erosion that is occurring there at that point. And take a look at this comparison from 1911 to 1961. Look at the incredible degree of soil erosion that has taken place during that time period. And the fact of the matter is, folks, that most farmers across North America today are actually not farming their original topsoil at all, but they're farming subsoil. And even my family that migrated from Virginia to South Carolina in 1840 to establish their farm there that I grew up on. Do you know that by 1840, they had already lost, prior to their arrival, more than a foot of the original topsoil? So during the 6 generations that I represent on that farm, my family has always farmed subsoil, not topsoil. I'm going to read this to you, and I want you to guess who said this and when. But the statement is, a few years more of increased sterility will drive the inhabitants of the Atlantic states westward for support, whereas if they were taught how to improve the old instead of going in pursuit of new and productive soil, they would make these acres, which now scarcely yield them anything, turn out beneficial to themselves. Now, who said that and when? George Washington in 1796. So folks, the Atlantic states, by the time we were just a fledgling country, a brand new nation, we had already farmed out the eastern portion of this country. This is a satellite view of a massive dust storm occurring in eastern Colorado, western Kansas in January. This shouldn't be happening at any time, much less in the dead of winter. But you can see how massive it is. This is the same dust storm view from ground level. And then if we compare 2014 to the original Dust Bowl, and notice I said the original Dust Bowl, because we're about that close, folks, to our second major Dust Bowl here in North America. We're seeing this all over the place. About 3 weeks ago, Gabe and Ray and Dave and I did a 3-day soil health workshop out in Elk City, Oklahoma. So about 140 miles or so west of Oklahoma City. And the very last day of that workshop, we finished up and I had to drive back to Oklahoma City to the airport there to fly out. Cold front was moving in, and the wind was blowing across the plains there at about 40 miles an hour. And here's the deal. Across that entire 140-mile plus drive on I-40, red dust was blowing the entire way. Never let up. And in places along the interstate, I had to slow down to below 30 miles an hour just to see. And by the time I got to Oklahoma City, it was totally enveloped in a red haze. So we are almost there, yet again. The hypoxia problem. I live down in Mississippi. So this significantly impacts us on the Gulf Coast to the tune of billions of dollars of lost income a year. This last year, for those of you that followed the media about this, it was a record-sized dead zone, over 8,770 square miles in size. And if you take a look at this map here, you'll see the pink area there is the area that drains into the Mississippi River and then into the Gulf of Mexico. So that's the area that created that dead zone. And here's what it looks like in real life. So you can see the stark contrast there in the Gulf. Another challenge that we faced this year, several major hurricanes, among them Hurricane Harvey. Harvey dumped between 30 and 52 inches of rain on South Texas. Now, that much rain is going to cause flooding, especially in low-lying areas like that. But that area historically was coastal tallgrass prairie with significant organic matter, significant water infiltration capacity in the soil. And I'm going to submit to you today that the devastation of the floods that occurred could have been far less if we would have had soil surrounding the greater Houston area that actually could infiltrate water. But I've measured on those farms and ranches in that coastal prairie down there, I've measured tens of thousands of soil samples. And I'm going to tell you, the soil aggregate layer is less than a ½ inch in most places. Water infiltration rates are well less than a ½ inch an hour. So that greatly exasperated the problem in the issue that we had and created more severe flooding impact than we should have seen. The Ogallala Aquifer, I saw this just yesterday in the newspaper, is, you know, it underlies portions of 8 states in the central U.S., covering an area of about 175,000 square miles. But over the last several decades, the water level has been dropping steadily. And over the last 6 years, it has shrank twice as fast as it did in the previous 60. And on top of that, because of this, streams are drying up at a rate of 6 miles per year. 6 miles of streams per year drying up because of the decline of this aquifer. And between 2013 and 2015, it lost 10.7 million acre-feet of storage. Another thing that we're facing globally is the insect ecosystem collapse. And we're seeing more and more data about this on a routine basis. One of my very good friends and colleagues is Dr. Jonathan Lundgren of Blue Dasher Farms and Ecdysis Labs. And Jonathan just has some absolutely astounding but also frightening data for those of you that have heard him. You know, we've got a lot of issues, folks. We've got a lot of things to correct.
So a little bit about the history of our operation. The operation that I'm on was founded by my in-laws back in 1956, and they farmed it from 1956 to 1991 when my wife and I purchased a part of it from them. The cropping system consists of about 2,000 cropland acres. Now, my in-laws farmed it heavy tillage. It was half summer fallow, half crop. Intense tillage then, you know, multiple passes. They primarily just grew spring wheat, oats, and barley, all cool season small grains. And they did it with synthetics, fertilizers, pesticides, some fungicides, repeatedly every year. I was fortunate when my wife and I purchased it from them in 1991. We did some baseline soils work. And what we found was that organic matter levels were only 1.7 to 1.9% on the cropland. Now, historically speaking, soil scientists will tell you that in the northern plains there, organic matter levels should have been in the 7 to 8% range. So in other words, we had lost over 75% of the organic matter due to the way it was farmed, due to those farming practices. Now, NRCS came out in 1991 and they did some baseline infiltration work. And they found on those cropland acres, we could only infiltrate 1/2 inch of rainfall per hour. Now, we only get 10 to 11 inches of rain per year. Then we get approximately another 4 to 5 inches of water from the 70, or in this year's case, 90+ inches of snow we get. It's very dry snow. So we're working on about 15 to 16 inches of total precip. Well, if I can only infiltrate 1/2 inch per hour, and a lot of our rainfall comes in May, June as heavy thunderstorms, that means we're going to lose most of it. It's going to run off the soil, not infiltrate, taking with it soil particles and any nutrients. I did some studying and I came across winter triticale and hairy vetch. They're both fall seeded biennials. You seed them in the fall, they start to grow, you can get a little grazing out of them, but then they come the next spring. And the reason I started down that path was to take advantage of another synergy in nature, and that's the interaction through mycorrhizal fungi that plants have. Because what really happens, hairy vetch being a legume, it'll fix nitrogen, and then it'll transfer that nitrogen through mycorrhizal fungi to the triticale plant, which is a grass plant, thus improving the growth of the triticale. The triticale, in turn, will uptake phosphorus, and through mycorrhizal fungi, it'll pass that on to the legume, the hairy vetch.
What we were taught in terms of what plant roots do was only half the story, because we learned that plant roots are, essentially straws that help facilitate acquisition of nutrients from the soil. But they also push stuff out into the soil, things called exudates, which many of you have probably heard of, and which consist of things like sugars, carbohydrates. Plants have a monopoly on being able to turn carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates, and they have this wonderful side effect of pushing oxygen into the atmosphere, which we all appreciate. But they also build a botanical world that way. They have a monopoly on being able to do that. But they will push out up to about 30 to 40%. Some plants, 30 to 40% of the material they build through photosynthesis, they'll push it out of their roots into the soil as exudates. They exude it into the soil. And what are those materials? It's the carbohydrates, the sugars that I mentioned. It's also proteins. They'll do hormones. But last year there was a paper that came out where people documented plants pushing fats, lipids, out into the soil. What are carbohydrates, proteins, and fats? That's food, lunch, breakfast, dinner. It's food, basically. Plants are pushing food out into the soil, and they're not doing it simply because they have too much food. They're doing it to feed those microbes in the soil. Those microbes, the reason that the rhizosphere is such a life-dense zone is not because pests and pathogens are gathering to attack plants. They're gathering because the plants are setting a subterranean buffet for microbes. Now, why would plants do that? How many of us give away 30 to 40% of our annual income? Other than taxes, that is. Or maybe there is a good analogy there. Maybe the plants are taxing themselves to actually support this their microbial assistance out in the soil that couldn't survive without the food that they're getting from the plants. And the plants get something in return, kind of the way that we get roads to drive on and a military to protect us. There are some benefits from being taxed. We could argue about the level, but that's not what we're going to do today. But there's something that's going on in the rhizosphere is that there's a biological bazaar going on. There's interchanges and interactions between the microbial life in the soil and the plants. And this shows you sort of a blow-up of what Ann and I have termed the biological bazaar, where microbes and plants are trading nutrients, metabolites, and exudates. And in that centerpiece where you see that root coming down with the blue thing is the rhizosphere, where you've got all kinds of bacterial and fungal life. The plants are pushing the exudates out into the soil, those black lines, and that stuff doesn't stick around very long. It gets consumed. It gets about 1 millimeter to 1 centimeter, about the thickness of my thumbnail to the length of my thumbnail, out away from roots into the soil before something eats it. And what happens to stuff that gets eaten? It gets metabolized. And what happens to the waste products of metabolism? An organism will excrete them. And so we have all these microbial metabolites coming back out into the root zone of plants, right around roots, because that's where they're living and things are being consumed. What are those kind of metabolites? When Ann and I learned that those include things like plant growth promoting hormones, we were astounded. Because here you have microbial life in the soil, bacteria in the soil, producing hormones to make plants grow and to keep plants healthy. Think about that. That's one sort of whole kingdom of life making fundamental compounds that would promote the health of a completely different kingdom of life. The only reason they're doing that is these are mutually beneficial exchanges, true symbioses, partnerships between life in the soil and the plants that are growing in it. And these partnerships go back to the very dawn of life on land, because the first plant fossils that we have examples of have mycorrhizal fungi intertwined with their roots. The fungi these partnerships helped plants come ashore and colonize the continents. Roots originally were simply structural supports. The fungi fed the plants.
You have to have soil aggregates. A soil aggregate will only last approximately 4 weeks, and then new ones need to be formed. If we go out and continually till our soils, we're going to tear apart that mycorrhizal fungi, and there's no way it'll be there to exude those biotic glues. It also takes biology to build soil aggregates. Third operation had been practicing no-till for 20 years. I called it medium diversity. They grow corn and sunflowers and malting barley, occasionally spring wheat, soybeans. So there's a little bit of diversity, but high use of synthetics. Fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides, tremendous use of synthetics. This is the poorest soil that Dr. Haney tested. That's like a brick. I mean, and the reason being, even though it's 20 plus years of no-till, that high use of synthetics, what does that do? Kills mycorrhizal fungi, kills soil biology. In my mind, this is more or less a hydroponic situation. The only purpose of that soil is to hold the plant upright, because this soil is not transferring nutrients. This had the poorest water infiltration of any of those we tested, well under ½ of an inch per hour. Here's the test. This is pounds per acre of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then over here is water extractable organic carbon. In other words, the food that biology eats. So the top line's the organic producer. Then we have the low diversity flax springwheat producer. Then we have the high synthetic producer. Look at that. There ain't a lick of difference between those three producers. So in my mind, it doesn't matter if you're organic. It doesn't matter if you're low crop diversity. It doesn't matter if you're no-till for 20 plus years. It's what are you doing to treat your operation as an ecosystem. And the same thing holds true for your garden. These tests can be taken garden level too. Now the bottom line is ours. Okay, look at that. Nitrogen, I have 281 pounds per acre at the time of this sample sitting there. I can grow any cash crop I want and not have to add any synthetic nitrogen. Phosphorus, look at my phosphorus levels. For years, I was told by scientists, Gabe, your system is going to crash. You're going to run out of phosphorus and potassium. Really? I keep getting more every year. Now, technically, obviously, it doesn't appear out of nowhere. But what this is measuring is in the top profile. Our plant roots and biology make more of that available. They're converting the organic phosphorus into inorganic. They're bringing it up, making more of it available. Obviously, we're not multiplying it, okay? But look, I haven't added any yet. I can produce any crop and then some on those amounts. The most important thing in my mind, though, is right here. How much food do I have for soil life? Look at that, 5 times the amount of any of the other producers. Yes, sir?
Is yours just livestock, or do you also do grain?
Oh, no, we do a lot of grain farming. The question was, do I only add livestock? Are we grain farming? Yes, we are grain farming. Okay? Yes?
So are those numbers for perennial pasture? Or?
These numbers are off of cropland, because we were comparing like to like. So this is cropland acres. On our operation, we have accomplished this with 0 added fertility, no microbials, no foliars, or any other input added to the system with the exception of seed, because I do buy cover crop seed, and a small amount of livestock mineral. Last year, we run a little over 300 cow-calf pairs. We run between 400 and 800 yearlings and grass finishers. We have a flock of sheep. We've got pastured pork. We've got 1,000 laying hens, plus some broilers. We use less than 1 ton of livestock mineral. So to say that's really adding, yes, it is, but a minute amount, okay? So the only compost we use, and I'll talk more about this later, is a little bit in our larger scale vegetable gardens. That's it. We don't use any out on the cropland field.
There's several really specific beauties that organic matter brings to the soil. One is that it unleashes carbonic acid. So if you have rocks, anybody have rocks in your fields? Anybody got rocks here? Anybody pick rocks? Yeah. Okay. So here's my question. If you go out in your field and you pick up a rock, does that rock have all the molybdenum, boron, cobalt, zinc, calcium that it had 500 years ago? Yeah, if it didn't, it'd be dissolved, right? Well, what dissolves rock? How do you get all those minerals out of rocks? Well, I could bring that rock, set it up here on the table and say, I wonder how much, what's the mineral complexion of that rock? And we could treat it with hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, prussic acid, all sorts of things. But if we wanted the most efficacious acid to treat it with, to break out the minerals, you know what we treat it with? Carbonic acid. Now, when vegetable matter decomposes in the soil, it exudes carbon dioxide, CO2. When CO2 interacts H2O, all right, I'm not a chemist, but I do know this, okay? CO2 plus H2O equals carbonic acid. So many times our mineral deprivation in our soils generally is not because we don't have enough minerals. Everybody's got fields full of rocks. Our problem is we don't have enough organic matter decomposition going on. How do we get organic matter decomposition? We have in situ carbon going in there, whether we supply it with composting, wood chipping, long-stemmed varieties, for, you know, whatever. The point is to stimulate the carbonic acid cycle. Another reason is because every 1% increase of organic matter equals 20,000 gallons of extra water retentive capacity. Every 1% of organic matter, because it's the porosity, it's the sponge of the soil. Another reason to increase organic matter is that it unleashes the microorganism community in our favor. Two examples I can give you. One is Azotobacter bacteria. Ever heard of Azotobacter bacteria? We're all familiar with the rhizomes on the end of legumes, you know, that concentrate nitrogen. Well, Azotobacter are actually nitrogen-free bacteria that don't depend on anything. I mean, they don't depend on legumes. They just live in the soil, but they're dormant until the soil is 4% organic matter. If you're less than 4% organic matter, they just go into hibernation. But at 4% organic matter, they all, I guess, talk to each other and say, hey, it's okay, we can come out now, you know, we can come out and play. And they will actually bring in 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year if they're active. Can I hear it for organic matter? Hey, hey, okay. And how about another one? This is a huge one that's really just kind of come to the fore because, you know, the anti-animal movement is growing so rapidly, especially in our urban sectors. The disease of the urban disease called veganism. And essentially, you know, it says that cows are, you know, burping and farting and destroying the planet. And so there's another bacteria that's really come to the fore. It's called methanotrophic bacteria. Methanotrophic bacteria. And they don't live under concrete. They don't live under schoolyards. They don't live under cornfields. They don't live under plowed fields. They live under perennial prairie, perennial pastures that are healthy. And a healthy population of methanotrophic bacteria will reach out and grab the equivalent methane of 1,000 cows per acre and put it in the soil. So, there's a lot of reasons to increase that organic matter. That is real economy. That's real economy. If I can get my soil to reach out and grab nitrogen out of the air, who wants to quit buying any nitrogen? Okay, this is a true economy.
Look at that crust on the soil surface. And I see this often as I travel really anywhere in North America, but specifically in the eastern half of the United States. I often see this in the cornfields, that type of crust forming. How's water going to infiltrate in there? So where I once started with only ½ of an inch per hour, now I can infiltrate 2 inches in 25 seconds. We only get 10 to 11 inches a year. It's not how much rainfall you get. How much can you infiltrate into the soil? And then due to the amount of organic matter you have, you'll hold for when you need. We create most of our own droughts by our management. I was out in California putting on a workshop, and you don't understand, we're in a drought. I said, really? Well, what's rainfall? We've only had 30 inches this year. And I'm like, and how much have you infiltrated? And when you do infiltration tests out there, well under an inch an hour. They think they're in a drought, but they've destroyed their soil resource, so they cannot infiltrate what water they do get.
On the left, we start with a tray of dry, loose soil taken from a clean till field. On the right, we start with a slice of intact surface soil from a long-term no-till field. This soil is not only protected with a mulch of cover crop residue, it also has a stable, porous sponge structure. You know, years ago, as a kid, I remember, you know, you'd get these big, heavy thunderstorms in the summer, and it would just wash the field, and you'd end up with mud down the road. And I'm talking about mud that you'd go over there with a skid loader and scoop out of the way so the cars could go down the road. what I'm seeing now is I'm seeing these heavy rainfalls, and I'm barely seeing a trickle coming out of the field. After we simulate an extremely intense thunderstorm for 5 minutes, the differences are obvious. Most of the water we applied to this soil has run off into this jar, carrying away with it a thin but very significant layer of topsoil.
What else ran off? All the nutrients, right?
We just applied 1.5 inches of very intense rainfall to this bare, tilled soil. Obviously, we harvested very little for future plant use.
So why do we till our gardens?
Meanwhile, this no-till soil has absorbed virtually every drop of water we applied. What little ran off is clear. The bottom line is pretty simple. If you want to harvest more rain like these no-till farmers are doing, keep your soil covered on top and make it a sponge underneath.
If you have too much water, you need to increase your crop intensity. In other words, grow cover crops to utilize that water to cycle carbon. If you don't have enough water, you need to increase the water holding capacity of your soil. The only way to do that is by growing something. Taking CO2, increasing organic matter in your soils. Approximately 2/3 of the organic matter increase in soils comes from roots. You got to grow something. That's the whole key. See, it's totally antagonistic to what we've been taught for the last 50 to 70 years. This is a triticale field. Looks pretty pathetic, right? Not going to be much crop to harvest there. Look, it's barely headed out. See a lot of bare soil. Okay. Here's a diverse polyculture. See the triticale in that's all headed out? Looks healthy, right? What's amazing is they're side by side. Planted the same date. That is just amazing when you look at it. Now think of the ramifications on production agriculture. You can, and I'll show you what we're doing. We're planting multi-species, so whatever cash crop's taller, the cover crops stay lower and you can combine. But this is the synergies we need to be taking advantage of. In the pink there, that's Dr. Yamili. She was responsible for that. Look at that. That's just absolutely mind-blowing. What we've gone to in our operation is rarely will I plant a monoculture. So this is oats with 3 types of clover growing in it. This is corn with hairy vetch growing in it. This is a diverse mix of cool season broadleaves. We graze that mix. This here is my sunflowers, and there's actually 19 different species of covers growing underneath that sunflower crop. So I'm trying to never grow a monoculture because I know how nature functions. So with all those species, I'm getting the synergy of legumes, cycling nitrogen. I'm getting all the diversity to feed biology a very diverse diet. I'm improving root structure, increasing organic matter, collecting maximum sunlight to cycle carbon. So this was a particular cover crop I seeded in August. There we are by mid-September. Now I guarantee you that's had less than 1 inch of rain on it since seeding, because our rain usually shuts off in early July and we don't get rain again until late September usually. You know, that's not uncommon for us at all. But look at the diversity out there. What I'm really trying to do is feed everything. Both the above ground biology, in this case wildlife, also the insects. And so many people look at insects as a pest. We need to change our mindset as far as that's concerned. This is Phacelia, and there's a native pollinator bee on there. I had a group from the Xerces Society out to my place last summer, and they were just going nuts because they've never seen as many species of native pollinators. But the reason is we try and have pollinating flowers to attract the pollinators blooming at all times throughout the growing season on our operation. It's a proven fact that if you have a beehive located within a quarter mile of any of your crops that need pollinating, you're going to get about a 10% increase in pollination rates. Why wouldn't you want that? Why wouldn't you want to attract them? You know? The other thing is, a lot of these insects are predators, like lady beetles. They're ferocious predators. Why do I want to go apply some chemical, especially on food we're going to eat, but I don't want to apply it anyway, when I can have predator insects that'll take care of them for me? Jonathan Lundgren, who's a really good entomologist, told me this. For every insect species that's a pest, there are 1,700 that are beneficial. So here farmers are out there trying to kill that pest. Why not just try and provide a home for a few of the 1,700? They're going to take care of that pest, right? You know, it just amazes me how backwards we've gone in production agriculture. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but this is pretty good. So they layered sawdust and some compost. And this is the earthworms eating that sawdust over a period of days, if you look in the lower left there. This takes a few minutes, but look at that. Isn't that amazing? If you have a healthy population of earthworms, what will that do to your soils? Yeah, what are we doing with tillage, with synthetics? What are we doing to our soils?
Do you ever need to bring in earthworms?
Do I ever need to bring in earthworms? I never, ever had. They just spread and come. Yep, build it and they'll come. No doubt about it. Look at that. By day 18, you couldn't even tell that. That's pretty amazing, I think. Yes?
So when you're transitioning from your cash crop to a cover, you're able to put the cover down without doing any tillage as well?
Correct.
You're drilling that cover in?
We're drilling the cover directly in. We haven't tilled anything since 1993 was the last tillage pass. No reason to till. We noticed we quit using all those anthelmintics and insecticides on livestock back in 2007. We had 0 dung beetle species. We couldn't find a single one for the first 2 years. Now we've actually got 16 species. This is an old slide that we've documented now on our place. And we didn't introduce them at all. They just come. They'll find you. They'll migrate and find the herds where, that are not using those. And we have a lot of other predator insects. This is yellow dung flies. They'll feed on the fly larvae. Works great. And then we have things, hister beetles, rove beetles. There's many different types of insects that are predators. Dragonflies, I mean, they're just deadly, 90+% kill rate on flies. I don't know what grad student found that out, but that's a meaningless fact, okay? The other thing is we use rotation a lot. We move our livestock daily through the growing season, and that really helps for control of pests also. Velvet mites, blister beetles, there's many, many of them. Orb weavers, how would you like to be a fly trying to get through that pasture, you know? Now, I tell people my 30-year-old son is single. Here's one of the reasons why. He actually charts the populations of those different insects. He spends a lot of time looking through manure, and I told him, if I ever want grandkids, you got to quit doing that, you know? But he's charted. His whole point here is realize, this is months of the year, realize, you know, come February, we're actually starting to see some dung beetles show up even that early in a healthy environment. But notice during the natural life cycle, when this particular yellow dung fly is down in population, there's other ones that are up. And he's got this all figured out. I don't know. He'd have to explain this to you. But the important thing I'm trying to get across here is in a healthy ecosystem, this is how nature functions. Nature takes care of those things. And Paul, my son's actually figured out how many dollars he's going to save in his lifetime by not buying all those inputs. And it's just staggering. He'll be able to retire really wealthy. So we have not used a pesticide since before the turn of the century, with the exception of seed treatment on corn, and simply because I wasn't able to find non-treated corn seed up until 2010. Then I simply started buying organic seed, and now we're actually growing open pollinated corn that we're saving our own seed. Okay? No need to, since predator insects take care of the pests for us. If you build it, they will come, plain and simple. Here's another interesting fact. This work was done also by Dr. Jonathan Lundgren. He found that in an average grain field in South Dakota, there was 162,000 weed seeds per square meter. If you have a healthy population of insects, they'll eat 10% of the weed seeds per day. Per day. Think of what that, I often get asked the question, Gabe, don't all these cover crops that you're letting go to seed become weeds? I just don't see it, and this is the reason why. That healthy population of insects in the soil is taking care of it for us. Okay, I'm going to show you a few ways quickly to use covers to address resource concerns. So I showed you the neighbor's field with the poor infiltration. Here was a photo back about 3-4 years ago. My son said, Dad, for Father's Day, they're having a soil health tour. Yeah, I'd love to go on it. This is the photo we took. The guy was showing us his field. He was so proud of it. He says, yeah, I got a little problem usually every spring because we till heavily. And I'm like, oh boy, we got a long way to go.
I had to sleep with the devil. What I mean by that is I had to pour Ivomec on cattle. If I didn't Ivomec those cows and they came into our farm, I didn't get cattle. And the easiest time to do it was when they're coming out of the chute. So we'd Ivomec all the cattle. And I noticed my manure paths were not breaking down. They weren't breaking down, but I did it anyway. Today, you can't find a manure pad on our farms. Folks, this is a really instrumental tool. We need that guy, and that's why right there. I mean, that's a big hole. It's about the diameter of a nickel. And right now, you know, the dung beetles come into your manure paths and break those down. They're putting holes down that deep. Well, if you've got 10,000 holes around your farm, or let's say 3 or 4 holes underneath every manure pad, what happens when you get a rain? Darn right. You're soaking up water. It's not running onto your neighbors. Also, that dung beetle's rolling up a ball, and he's putting it down in the bottom of that hole, just like this. That's him. That's pretty nasty looking, isn't it? I mean, that's just gross. I used to look at these little guys, folks, every morning when I go do chores. I milked a cow for 12 years at home. I made the mistake of asking my dad if I could milk the cow when I was 2nd grade. And I got a couple streams going in that bucket. He said, son, it's yours. He walked away. But I remember going out to milk the cow in the morning, and those things were everywhere. This is before Ivomec was ever developed. They were everywhere. And we didn't have manure. We didn't have hardly any flies. Folks, the flies lay their larvae in that manure pat, and the flies hatch out, and they attack your cow.
There are literally hundreds of secondary and tertiary chemical compounds that exist in all of these different plants. But the key is that you don't have the same secondary and tertiary compounds in the same plants, okay? So the only way that you can get the diversity of these secondary and tertiary nutritive chemical compounds is through plant species diversity and complexity. And what Fred found is that given the option and the ability to select, livestock will actually eat from 50 or more different plants in a single day, okay? Given that option. So what are they doing? They're balancing their own diet. In other words, they're smart enough to do that if we give them the opportunity, but when we have monocultures, we're not giving them that opportunity, folks, okay, at all. All they can eat is what's in front of us. It's like us going to a buffet and the only thing on the buffet is celery, okay? So that's our choice. That's all we get. In a way, we're doing that to our livestock, and then to supply whatever else they may need, what are we having to do? We're having to supplement, okay? And supplementation is never cheap.
We can get really good gains on this. This past year, we averaged 4.05 pounds a day gain on our finishers, and those finishers were weighing from 1,000 to 1,350 pounds, and we're still getting that kind of gains on there. Year in and year out on our covers, we'll easily average 2¼ pounds a day gain or more on these. Here's, this was just taken this last fall. This was a brown red rib, sorghum, Sudan, cowpea, mung bean, kale mix with some clover. And see, we're letting them just strip the leaves and they're leaving the rest. That's the armor, that's the carbon to cover the soil, but they're putting on tremendous weight gain while doing that.
See that crop right there? They mowed it. He's going to grow potatoes next year. Do you think he's going to leave that? Oh, no. a big old Miller disc comes, it's a sunflower, safflower disc or something, pulls in here, Summers disc, I guess, and disc it down. Waits 2 weeks, puts a ton of compost on, disc it down again. Now, the growing season's really short. We're in North Colorado. Then the next spring, he starts out, potatoes, we're going to till it again, we're going to plant potatoes, we're going to hill them, and we're going to dig them. And what were his pictures at the Acres Conference? In that country, you only get 5 inches of rain, and it's all irrigated. And what the irrigation rigs do is the guys that do irrigation have straw bales on the end of the field to fill in the wheel tracks because they sink in because of this light soils and all this rain. And now that he's been doing this system, there's no more straw bales, and his irrigation rigs are running on top. The soil structure has completely changed with aggressive tillage. Now, he says, I think it was my herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, and pesticides, and nitrogen that was destroying my soil before, because he said it certainly changed, and it certainly has nothing to do with tillage. So I think we got to look deeper at some of these things, and that fits his situation. Now, I'll show you some things about this here, but I just want to go through, because a friend of mine in Iowa went to a cover crop meeting, and he had a 9-way or 7-way cocktail mix, and it was $40 an acre. And the guy said, oh my gosh, how can you afford that? And Bob said, oh, by the way, I doubled the application rate. It was on $80 an acre. And he said, I want to know, how not? He said, it's my nitrogen, it's my nutrient storage, it's my time-release fertilizer, it's my erosion protection and building my soils, it's my carbon sequestering, getting more organic matter in my soils, it's my insect control, it's my disease prevention, and he says, I'm building my resilience in my soil, and I'm increasing water holding capacity, and I'm at my weed control better. I did that all for $80 an acre.
We saw that we were using water up front, like I said earlier, but as the rains do come, our infiltration rates are higher, and so we gain that back pretty quick. And then once we get into the growing season a little bit further, then we're water ahead in the end.
So now that I'm planting into it green, I'm getting much more even stands. My soil organic matter is growing. I've got much better earthworms than I've ever had. Last year was the first year I've ever had my no-till beat my conventional in yields. And we're much better conventional farmers than we are no-tillers. So he's actually become a believer in it, which he's always kind of my truth tester. I'm always looking, people think I'm a little crazy just because we're planting into stuff that looks like this, and I know it's not conventional. I know it doesn't look right. It doesn't look correct. But I'm like, well, if I can get my father to run a planter and plant into, headed out barley and be happy with the job the planter's doing, the way it plants, all the fundamentals of farming, and then he's happy when we're combining and the yields are better than where we conventionally tilled, I'm like, well, that's, wish I'd done it sooner.
My philosophy is that if I take care of the soils are going to take care of the vegetables. So I do a lot of cover cropping on the farm, on bare ground. If at all possible, I have cover crops on it. I do a lot of cover cropping, interplanting with crops to bring in beneficial insects. I use a lot of mulch, as you can see, all the straw that's in between the beds. There's a lot of different components that are involved in creating and maintaining healthy soils.
You have a plant that's growing in a organic matter and nutrient poor soil. You can support it, you can grow it on a fertilizer diet. You can feed it the NPK that it needs. You can feed it a lot of it, and you can grow big plants. You can get big yields. We all know this. And in fact, if you have degraded soil, that's one of the reasons that intensive agrochemical use became very central to modern agriculture in the 20th century. Is we had already degraded our soil organic matter and fertility of lands in the developed world. But what does that do to the plants? Plants don't put out as extensive a root system if they're getting most of the macronutrients they need. Ann and I turn that behavior couch potato crops. They get kind of lazy. They don't put out the same root system. That means they're not putting out as many exudates. That means they're not recruiting as many, they're not exerting the same selective pressure on the soil life, so they're not getting the same composition of beneficial organisms in the soil as they would if they were growing in a very organic matter-rich soil, what Ann and I term here the soil health diet, which you could still fertilize them if you're basically need to add NPK to it, but by having a healthy, fertile soil, you're getting more in the way of the micronutrients that the fungi will provision for the plants, and you're getting more of those beneficial microbial metabolites that promote the health of the plants. So here we have a fairly simple explanation, perhaps, for why the global demand for pesticides went through the roof as the global use of fertilizers went through the roof. we disarmed the defensive systems of our plants. And that's not to slam fertilizers, but it's to basically argue that we need to think about the way that plants eat and defend themselves and nourish themselves, what makes plants healthy, because the connection between healthy soil and healthy plants is actually now pretty clean and pretty clear. I ran across a paper from Iowa in 2015 that reported that 25% of the farmers in Iowa lost money on every acre they planted that year. Their input costs were higher than they could get for their corn. What that reflects is that modern conventional agriculture has gotten so good at growing commoditized crops that it's driven the price of those crops down, but the methods that are being used to grow them depend on inputs that are based on fossil fuels, the price of which have been going through the roof. And the companies on either end do just fine. It's the farmers that are squeezed in the middle. And to me, that's the big sort of untold story of the demise of family farms in America, is that we managed to convince farmers to farm in a way that decades on, they're squeezed and it's being balanced on their backs in the middle. So we're basically paying farmers to destroy their soil these days. This is not good long-term social policy by any stretch of the imagination, and those programs really need to be reformed to try and reward farmers who are engaging in practices that build and sustain the fertility of their soil. We could use more demonstration farms like Dwayne Beck's Dakota Lakes Farm, like Kofi Boa's no-till center in Ghana, showing farmers a different way to do it because you're doing it at full scale on a farm and showing that it works is a really good way to get the word out. And we could also provide assistance for that transition between the 2 to 3 years that it takes to convert methods. We should be backstopping farmers who are adopting the methods to regenerate the fertility of their soil.
I don't care if we're talking lack of moisture, compaction, low fertility, salinity, too much moisture, too little moisture, on down the line. All those things are really just symptoms of a degraded resource. That's all we've been doing as producers, is treating the symptoms. We're not solving the problem. In my mind then, I come to the conclusion that the current production model was only about killing. You were either going to kill weeds, you were going to kill pests, you were going to kill a fungus, but we also are killing our diversity, we're killing our soil, and we're killing our profit. Now, I couldn't find any projections for North Carolina, but this was the projections last year for North Dakota. The projected return of the major cash crops. Look at that. Every single one was a negative. Now, that really makes you want to run out and farm, doesn't it?
What Gabe does is he basically moves his cows around a lot. He follows the practices of the style of grazing that the buffalo practiced, which was clumping up in a herd because the wolves were out and grazing intensely on an area, but always moving, and then once they'd grazed an area, they wouldn't come back for a year. So it was high disturbance, low frequency grazing. And that's what Gabe is practicing on his ranch, and what Neil Dennis, another Saskatchewan cattle ranch that I visited, were doing. They've managed to greatly increase their stocking density while restoring their prairie soils, and as a not unrelated restoration, they've restored the prairie vegetation communities on their fields.
Look at that black layer there. A little more than 10 years ago, he was farming the yellow clay that you see underneath that black layer. A little more than 10 years ago. So in 10 years, folks, in 10 years, through adaptive grazing and complex cover crop utilization, they have added almost 2 feet of brand new topsoil.
Allan Savory. Born in Zimbabwe and educated in South Africa, Bachelor of Science in Zoology and Botany, founder and president of the Savory Institute. The institute, based in Boulder, Colorado, serves the world through an international network of entrepreneurial innovators who offer holistic management training and implementation support. So with no further ado, we're going to give you Mr. Savory.
And I said, let's take the worst land we can find and test the ideas and see if we can cause it to fail. And if we test the ideas and we cannot cause it to fail, then we move ahead. So they agreed to that. We selected 4,000 acres. On this 4,000 acres, in fact, all the land surrounding it, for a 100-mile drive, I was prepared to pay the group that was selecting the land a £5 note that was about $10 if they could find a single grass plant. So we didn't have a single grass plant that we knew of for 100 miles around that. And that became solid perennial grassland. And we were trying to make that fail. We trebled the stocking rate in the first year on that bare ground with planned grazing, and it just became grassland. No feeding, no supplement, and we took the most difficult animals to run, first calving heifers. And we got higher conception rates, higher weaner weights. We produced 5 times as much meat per acre. And that entire project cost us $1.80 an acre to produce 5 times as much meat. We could not cause it to fail. The only time we've ever had to actually feed animals with bulk feed of any sort is when we're doing mine reclamation. Because when you're doing mine reclamation, you have 100% bare ground. There's not a shrub, there's not a weed, there's nothing. And so when we put a lot of cattle onto a mine dump to get the plants growing, we just use the cheapest, nastiest hay we can find. Because you just want it full of weeds and seeds. And that gives you the start, and then it goes from that. And people are doing that already in Arizona and other parts. But on the land, no matter what you saw in slides, how bad it was, we've never ever had to feed to get going. Now, I wouldn't advise you, if you're on a very bad bit of land, to double the livestock immediately like I did. I just did it right away. If you had a situation like that, I'd say no. Rather learn what it's about, visit others, learn the planning procedure, and wait until your growing season, and then do it as your growing season started. With these projects in Africa, I just started right away, because I was there to watch them and so on. Yeah. Okay.
I wanted to ask you, you talked about going from 3 species of grass to 19. Was that all natural seeds, or did you... We've
never had to reseed. So,
that was all just laying there bare in the bare soil?
Yeah, the seed is always there. I had a discussion with some folks, range folks in Nevada once. We were talking like this out on the land, and one of the guys from university there said this wouldn't work in Nevada because there's no seed. And I said to him, well, go anywhere in Nevada and just take a square yard of soil, scrape off the top half-inch, put that in trays, go and water it in your study, and if no plants come up, you give me a call and I'll send you $1,000. He never asked for his $1,000. I don't think you can find soil without seed in it.
If you're on a big ranch, big tracts of land, don't waste your time. Start looking at other ways. Now, other ways that we're developing are the herding, putting dogs periodically. If you just have a man with a horse and a couple of dogs for part of the day, just bunching the animals, just simulate the wolf, just getting them crowds somewhere, attractants, just finding ways to get them bunching, excited, moving.
Those hills over there on the horizon, that was solid sand when I was a kid, sand duny sand, and that's covered with big blue stem and little blue stem now. And it's by taking a lot of cattle in there, and we sometimes will run a herd of yearlings, and we had 2,300 head of yearlings in there, and it just tore the heck out of it. But a little moisture, and all of a sudden, boom, 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 shoots came up where you didn't have any grass at all.
When we run cattle on the ground, it really increases the soil health much quicker than when there's no livestock involved. The trampling effect, the biting and the chewing of the plants react differently when they're being grazed versus when they're just being cut, like with a mower. And they'll regrow more aggressively. The integration of all of the saliva and the dung and the urine, those all are increasing the biological activity of the soil. And we see much faster gains in soil health when we properly integrate the livestock.
Are you grazing on your cropland?
We are on some. So we have an issue. I have 23 landlords that I have to deal with. We farm 3 counties now. And some of my landlords like animals, some of them don't. Some of the properties have fence, some of them don't. And the ones that do allow us to put animals on there, we put animals on there. You'll see your ground change twice as fast with animals than you will with just straight cover crops. I think the urine and the manure and getting that biology through the rumen of the cattle and out the back, I think it does, you know, a world of difference. So we try to put as many animals on as many acres as we can.
We talk a little bit about bruising the soil. We want the animals to move across our landscape, and they have that cloven hoof. And see, there's billions and billions of microbes living on the root hairs of those plants. And when the animals walk across the landscape and step on that, it wakes them up. And they all start sourcing food. Maybe the predators start going after other little guys and eating them.
The next part of this whole carbon economy is perennials versus annuals. The energy flow, as you all know, the energy flow of perennials and annuals is completely different. Annuals are extractive and they put all the energy up here in this big plump squash or seed or watermelon or whatever. Perennials, the energy flow is all about going into this root mass that is the bank account, the savings account for the plant. And in controlled grazing, we call this pulsing the pasture, this whole, you know, this whole rest and growth cycle, because pulsing is like a heartbeat, and we're actually pumping the energy into the pasture as we prune off that biomass. So that's why in nature, all the deep soils on the planet are not under trees, they're not under bushes, they're certainly not under corn and soybeans, they're under perennial prairie pastures with herbivores running across them that are exhibiting 3 M's. I call it moving, mobbing, and mowing. They're not in the same place, they're not in the same field, they move. The migratory choreography is amazing. But they move along, they're mobbed up for predator protection, and they're mowing. They're not eating dead cows and dead chickens and, you know, ho-ho cakes left over from Pillsbury and all that stuff. They're mowing, okay? And the problem, the dysfunction of modern cattle production is the reason that we have things like Cowspiracy and What the Health and the UN Long Shadow Report and all this science impugning livestock farming is not because cows are bad, it's because we're managing them bad. And when you abrogate any one of these 3, moving, mobbing, mowing, you have what nature wants to have, this beautiful choreography of symbiosis and synergistic soil development, and what you do is you have dysfunction.
So here's the deal. You can go up to 50% plant leaf removal with a single grazing and only have 2 to 4% root growth stoppage. But look what happens when you simply go, you make another 10% jump. You remove an additional 10% of leaf material. Now all of a sudden you're up to 50% root growth stoppage, and you get up in the 70, 80% area, and you get up to 100% root growth stoppage. And you start losing roots below the ground, they start dying off, and they shorten up. If it's hot and dry, then what happens? It's much more susceptible. Your plants get highly stressed, right? And they can't regrow rapidly. But what's the other thing? Where did we say the microbes live? In the root zone. So if we shrink up that root zone, what are we doing? We're killing off a large portion of our microbial population at the same time. Ever had this happen? Okay. You know, you have cattle in a high stock density in a paddock, all of a sudden you get a big rainfall, and it looks like they've plowed it all up, right? So this was one of our clients, you know, this happened. They said, oh my gosh, what are we going to do here? What's going to happen? And I said, just let's do nothing. Let's wait and let's see. Let's give it some rest and recovery. And here's what happened. They tripled the forage dry matter production through that disruption, okay? Now, do you want to continuously do that? No. But my point is, planned disruptions can be very good. So what are some ways to be disruptive? Okay? Altering stocking densities. Rather than having the exact same stock densities all the time, alter them throughout the year in periods of the year. Do not move your rotations through your farm or your ranch in the same pattern every time. Okay? Alter the movement patterns through your farm and ranch each season, each year, so that you're not hitting each pasture at the exact same time of the year every year.
This is a farm we leased. We've had it since 2001, 250 acres, and it was continuously grazed. And it was a wreck. That was solid dirt all the way down to that little creek. And at that time, there was no water in that creek. Because when it rained, it just flushed that whole farm down to the neighbor. Now we've got catchment. We're catching the rainwater. That creek is flowing now. You don't want to step off in it. It's deep. It's waist deep. There's frogs in there. There's fish living in there. There's coons. There's all kinds of stuff along that riparian zone now. But we grazed it differently. We put animals on that for a short duration, then we moved them. We didn't leave them there. So I think cattle can really heal riparian zones if it's done correctly. But look at the diversity in that picture. I mean, there's everything in there, even my hated cocklebur. There's a few of them in there. You know, it's another plant, okay? But there's all kinds of stuff in there. And my neighbor, he's still grazing the other way. I'm catching his soil. It comes down my creek. His soil covers up my grass. It lays it over, and then my grass grows back up through his soil and plants it. That's how my creek banks are uppening. They're uppening with his soil. He doesn't want it, so I'll take it.
This is us just digging in a conventional field that's adjacent to one of our grazing pastures. And you can just see how hard the soil is, how difficult it was to get the shovel down on the ground. I'm about 165, 170 pounds, and I'm literally jumping up and down on the shovel, trying to get it into the dirt. And I could only get it in about halfway, whereas with 3 or 4 light jumps and just 1 foot in my pasture, the shovel went in as far as I could get it down. So here we're just showing the difference between my neighbor's dirt, which I borrowed from him for a couple of minutes for our experiment here. You can just see how much harder this is. And this is literally taken just a few feet away from where my pasture is. And you can just see how matter. Yeah, the organic matter in the soil really makes a huge difference. And we've got a long way to go here. Like, we've got a lot of room for improvement, but try to break his stuff apart. I mean, it'll eventually fall apart, but it's just not fillable like our stuff is. And what that means is that his dirt isn't going to hold water, and our dirt is. And that's what this is all about, is holding water so that we can grow grass and graze cattle and build soil.
The first year is going to be crappy, is the word I use. And why is it crappy? Because below my hat and in between my ears is not ready to learn how to look at the importance of the system. The second year is going to be better. The third year, that's when the system's going to start to turn a little bit. And then the fourth and fifth year, if you can get over the third year, you're never going back.